Hi everyone, this is Marcel from Helping Hands in Snake Safety, and today I would like to present the 3 different types of venom we can find in snakes in Zambia. Now the first one is cytotoxic venom, and cyto means cell. So this is venom that destroys cell tissue. So the venom gets injected, for example, in your hand or in your arm or in your lower legs, where usually snake bites occur, and it is a cytotoxic venom. Now you can imagine that if cell tissue is being destroyed, it immediately becomes extremely painful. So these are very painful bites. In addition, there will be quite a lot of swelling. So there's pain and swelling, and we call the syndrome associated with this painful, progressive swelling, PPS syndrome. PPS syndrome, painful progressive swelling, because the cell tissue is being destroyed. Venom number 2 is neurotoxic. Now neuro, it's already nervous system, so it affects the nerves. Basically what it does, it interrupts the messaging between the nerves and the muscles. And everything we do is guided by our brain. So if the signaling between the brain and the muscles no longer functions properly, we get weaker and weaker. We're less and less able to do what we do. And at some point it also affects our breathing, which means that we slowly suffocate to death. So because we get weaker and weaker, we call this one the weakness syndrome. And we call that the WS syndrome, the W syndrome. W syndrome, weakness syndrome. And because that weakness becomes worse and worse, it's called progressive weakness syndrome. Yeah. So initially it's, for example, very difficult to blink your eyes or keep your eyes open. We call that ptosis. But at some point you can't swallow properly anymore. You can't keep your head up, etc., etc. There's a whole cascade of problems. And at some point it affects breathing, which will kill you. Let's move to the third one, hemotoxic venom. Now, hemos is blood, so this affects the blood. Yeah. So what it does, it's making that the blood no longer can properly clot. So when we get a cut or anything on the skin and the skin is breached, our blood solves that by creating clots, and that creates a scab at some point. That makes sure that we don't bleed empty. Yeah. There's also a system in place to make sure that the blood stays where it is, in the veins, arteries, etc. Now, this venom does 2 things. First of all, it makes that blood clotting ineffective. Second of all, it also makes it possible for the blood to breach the membranes of the blood circulation. So that means blood goes everywhere. So the result is external bleeding, where you got bitten, it will at some point start bleeding, and it doesn't stop no matter how much pressure you put on, but also from your eyes, your nose, your ears, your mouth and your gums. Everywhere where you had very recent wounds which have not healed, it will start bleeding as well. But internally, blood starts to ooze everywhere where we don't want it, and the result is that we don't have enough blood in circulation to pump around oxygen and nutrients, etc., which the organs need. So at some point organ failure is going to happen, which means that you're going to end up in shock, which at some point kills you. It's a very slow working venom. Now, and because it affects the blood and the bleeding, we call this the bleeding syndrome. B syndrome. So we have cytotoxic, neurotoxic and hemotoxic venom. And we have painful progressive swelling syndrome, we have progressive weakness syndrome, and we have the bleeding syndrome. Now, of course, it's interesting to know which snake has which kind of venom. And then it becomes a bit more complicated than you would expect. For some it's very simple, but for others they have a combination of venoms. We start on the right side. The boomslang is one of those snakes that have seriously potent hemotoxic venom. It is assumed that this is one of the most potent venoms in the world. Then we have the twig snake. Let me write that correctly. Capital S. Now the twig snake has the same kind of venom as the boomslang, but it's less potent, and therefore in cases people can survive those kind of bites without antivenom as long as proper supportive therapy is being administered in a hospital. Now, neurotoxic. The most famous snake with neurotoxic venom is the black mamba. And then we have a group of snakes that also have this venom. They are the non-spitting cobras. So the snouted cobra and cheetah's cobra, we have the storm's water cobra, and the forest cobra. They all have this venom, yeah, the neurotoxic venom that goes after the nervous system. And then we have a couple of snakes that end up in this category. They're the puff adder, very famous, cause a lot of bites. We have the spitting cobras. In Zambia they are the Mozambique spitting cobra and the blackneck spitting cobra. And then we have the night adders. And we have the stiletto snakes. And recently we also added the garter snakes. Their venom is not very well studied, but we have seen that the effects of the venom that they inject is also cytotoxic. Now, there are a couple of other snakes we could add here, but their venom is not potent enough and they are very non-common snakes. So we don't include them on the lists here. Now, what is important to understand, oh, I forgot a very important one, the gaboon adder. Now, what is very important to understand is that there are some snakes that have a combination of venoms. So the puff adder can also show bleeding syndrome. The gaboon adder also can show bleeding syndrome. And even the blackneck spitting cobra can show bleeding syndrome. So that means that it's cytotoxic as well as hemotoxic venom. But we put them in this list because the cytotoxic effects are much more dominant. Yeah. Now, then the non-spitting cobras also have a bit of cytotoxin. Cytotoxin accompanying the neurotoxic venom. So what we see is that in these snakes, there's this whole cascade of problem, this whole what we call flaccid paralysis, that people get more and more paralyzed because they get weaker and weaker, but they also locally, there might be cell tissue destruction. Okay, so there might be some swelling at the bite site and there might be quite some pain, and it could even lead to amputation of fingers or toes in very bad cases. Yeah. So we have 3 different types of venom with 3 different syndromes: painful progressive swelling, painful weakness, and bleeding syndrome. And we have different snakes that have different venoms and sometimes a combination of venoms. Now, it's important to understand what kind of venom was injected. That's more important in treatment than which snake bit you. It is absolutely helpful to know I was bitten by this snake. But if we don't know, we still can see what kind of treatment is needed from the symptoms and the syndrome that has presented in the patient. I hope this was clear. Next time we'll make a video about first aid in different venom types.